Okay, so we're going to start off with the framework subject matters. If you think about building a house, every house needs a plan. Likewise, for a SOC 2, you would need a blueprint or foundation or principles that is going to describe to you what do you need to accomplish in order for you to become SOC 2 compliant. The 9 trust service criteria make up the framework which SOC 2 compliance is measured against. There are 4 additional trust service criteria, TSCs, that can be included in a SOC 2 assessment, but it is at the discretion of management and the lead implementer if they want to include it in the attestation. The TSC presented below, that we're going to get into in a bit, have been aligned to the 17 COSO principles which are listed as common criteria, the security principle. The TSC presented below have been aligned to the 17 COSO principles which are listed as common criteria. In addition to the 17 COSO principles, the TSC included additional criteria supplementing COSO Principle 12, which is the identity deploys control activities through policies that establishes what is expected and procedures that put policies into action. That is your supplemental criteria. The additional supplemental common criteria are reflected in the TSC logical and physical access controls up until risk mitigation. We'll get into those principles in a moment. Each common criteria have a couple of points of focus that guide management and the lead implementer on what controls will satisfy the common criteria. In essence, each point of focus represents important characteristics of the common criteria. Think about each point of focus being a way to guide you as the lead implementer or management as to what controls can be implemented or what controls can be used to satisfy each and every common criteria. As mentioned previously, there are 9 trust service criteria. The first one is control environment, followed by communication information, risk assessment, control activities, monitoring activities, logical and physical access, system operations, change management, and risk mitigation. Those are the 9 main trust service criteria which makes up the security principle. After that, we have the four additional supplemental criteria, which are availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, and privacy. We're going to start off with the first trust service criteria, which is control environment. Each control environment has a couple of common criteria, which will be supported by a couple of points of focus, which is basically your guidance in terms of what controls to implement to satisfy the common criteria and eventually the trust service criteria. Specifically focusing on control environment, we have 5 COSO principles that you can get more information on in the learning material. So let's get into control environment and what it is. A control environment refers to the service organization's compliance culture and includes everything from the organizational structure. That is your different departments, the culture, the organizational structure, management, as well as the ethical values. And this needs to filter from a top-down, or this needs to have a top-down approach as you execute this trust service criteria. There are a couple of examples that would be quite common across different kinds of companies. You would have an HR onboarding process, you will have an organizational chart, you will have a process in place that defines the ethical values of the company. You'll have board of directors, which will meet up in a quarterly basis, or they will meet up on a monthly basis. And this also speaks again to the flexibility of a SOC 2, depending on each organization and how they operate in their environment. Lastly, but not leastly, policies and procedures are quite important. They need to be implemented again from a top-down approach, which would provide the foundation for where on your controls will be built on. If the service organization has a well-functioning HR department, then compliance with this trust service criteria would be relatively easy. The second trust service criteria is communication and information. And as the trust service criteria says, it's all about communicating information to external and internal parties. Quality information and effective communication within a service organization can impact meeting internal control objectives. When the service auditor needs to gain an understanding of the service organization, the first place where they will start is how is policies and procedures being communicated to the rest of the organization. While documenting is a tedious job, hopefully digitally, it is a way to bring the service auditor up to speed and quickly have them conceptualize what the processes entail for the product or service that the SOC 2 attestation is going to be about. In terms of communication, this includes communicating expectations between the board of directors, management, and employees, and between the company and external parties. This will also include security awareness training for the employees, as well as the rest of management, the management at the service organization. Here are some examples that would be used in this trust service criteria. As mentioned, policies and procedures need to be in place. This can be policies ranging from HR, IT policies, bonus policies, KPC policies, etc. A very important policy to include among them would be your security incident policy that would communicate security incidents and how personal data breaches is dealt with. A website that provides typical information about your product to your customers as well as prospective customers. Service interruptions, communication channels, how they are managed. A support team that look after any service interruptions and how they are managed. A monitoring tool is deployed 24/7 to detect anomalies and service disruptions. While it is difficult to cover every specific common criteria requirement related to communication and information, this is a great starting point. If communication between various internal and external parties of the business is clear, maintained, and documented, this section should be easy to pass. Most issues we have here is the lack of maintaining evidence of these control activities, not the lack of the control activities themselves. The third trust service criteria is risk assessment. This is one of the more straightforward trust service criteria, which entails a company to only perform a risk assessment upon their control environment. When the service auditor looks at this trust service criteria, the service organization needs to think about performing a risk analysis that includes multiple tasks such as identifying assets, identifying threats and vulnerabilities related to those assets, determining the likelihood and impact of those risks being realized, as well as mitigating those risks and dealing with issues along the way. Some examples to include being the risk assessment being performed, the main one, should be a risk assessment register should be compiled where all risks are identified of the service organization, which includes rating those risks as well as the threats and the vulnerabilities identified. A risk assessment policy should also be annually reviewed and signed off, which dictate how risk is being managed at the organization. Regular risk assessment meetings should also take place, and these minutes should be recorded of every meeting and they should be safeguarded. Vulnerability assessments are performed on the IT environment as well to identify any vulnerabilities that might cause a risk to the organization. It is clear that this section of the SOC 2 revolves around the risk assessment process. This includes identifying the risk, mitigating the relevant risk, as well as implementing controls to minimize these risks. We will get to risk mitigation in a later trust service criteria, which talk about mitigating these risks. However, for this trust service criteria, it is important to have a risk management process in place, but more importantly, perform a risk assessment on your environment. It will also be key to document these processes, as the auditor will request that the risk assessment documentation be presented to them. Now we're moving on to the fourth trust service criteria, which is monitoring activities. Because every organization is different when it comes to monitoring activities, a service auditor will seek to understand what the organization does and how they are doing it during the SOC 2 audit. Considering this, in order for an organization to demonstrate that they comply with this trust service criteria, they'll need to show that they are conducting evaluations of internal control. The best way to achieve this trust service criteria is to have an internal audit function in place, which they will automatically have an audit plan in place, which will deal with the various controls that need to be required to satisfy this trust service criteria. Should the organization not have an internal audit function available, the board and management meetings that perform monitoring functions from that level should be suffice. Essentially, the best way to satisfy this trust service criteria is to either have an internal audit function, the board of directors, or management performing a monitoring activity on the internal control environment of the organization. That should be sufficient to address this trust service criteria. The fifth trust service criteria is control activities. Now, control activities might sound the same than the previous trust service criteria, which was monitoring activities. There are some differences. When the service auditor assesses an organization's compliance with this trust service criteria when performing a SOC 2 audit, they will want to see that the organization has implemented internal controls that assist them in accomplishing their business objectives. This trust service criteria can be a bit ambiguous, and it is intended to be broad in order to allow organizations the flexibility to implement the internal controls that would work best for their organization and the industry in which they operate in. Some of the examples will include controls relating to the risk assessment, which was previously discussed in the third trust service criteria, board and management meetings that will serve part as an oversight control, ensuring internal control is operating effectively. The next criteria is logical and physical access controls. This is your biggest trust service criteria and will include a lot of common criteria as well as point of focus to address this trust service criteria. This trust service criteria includes a variety of controls that relates to access control in the control environment. These controls include safeguards to monitor and restrict access to sensitive data and any devices or networks on which it is stored, transmitted, or processed. Service organizations need to demonstrate that they're taking physical and virtual measures to protect data privacy, integrity, and confidentiality. Because employees are the weakest link of every organization, the proper measures must be taken to mitigate the risks associated with human error prior to engaging in a SOC 2 audit. Furthermore, when service organizations assign roles and responsibilities to employees, they implement the concept of least access necessary. In essence, what that means is bare minimum access is given in order for the user to fulfill their job duties. Assigning roles and responsibilities assists service organizations in ensuring that there is segregation of duties so that there are no conflicts of interest within the organization. While malicious hackers often attack digitally, service organizations must account for the risk that their physical environments could be compromised as well. This means that implementing physical security controls in facilities or other locations that hold sensitive information needs to be top priority for service organizations. Here are a couple of examples of controls that can be implemented or designed in order to achieve this trust service criterion. A password policy should be in place with perimeters complying with best practice. Access to production should be restricted. A process should be in place that reviews and approves all user access. Terminated users' accounts should be managed in a timely manner. Users' access review should be performed on all users on a regular basis. Physical access should be managed and restricted to authorized personnel only. Endpoint management, disk-level encryption, passwords, and screen lock should provide extra security. Firewall rules are configured to restrict access to the computing environment and enforce boundaries for computing clusters. Access to backups is also restricted. Ultimately, this trust service criteria aims to ensure that service organizations meet their business objectives by protecting their sensitive assets from malicious internal and external threats, both digitally and by physical means. The next trust service criteria is system operations. During a SOC 2 audit, an auditor will assess that an organization meets the requirements of this trust service criteria by looking for the following. The entity used defined configuration standards. The entity monitors infrastructure and software. The entity implements change detection mechanisms. The entity detects unknown or unauthorized components, and the entity conducts vulnerability scans. The next trust service criteria is change management. This is one of your more important trust service criteria because a lot of the changes that goes through software, infrastructure, and other IT systems will need to follow a change management process. It is especially important that the service organization can demonstrate to the service auditor that they have an effective change management system in place. Change management systems provides organizations with policies and procedures for making updates to their IT infrastructure, which in turn helps mitigate the potential for overlooking any new vulnerabilities or risks created while changes are taking place. Service organizations have used a variety of different change management systems over the years, from simple forms to elaborate ticketing systems. Whichever way an organization chooses to implement their change management systems, though, they should end up with a database that allows them to review all of the changes that have been made at their organization, who authorized them, who tested them, and who implemented them. And there should be segregations of duties throughout those different roles that are being performed. The last trust service criteria before we get into the additional ones is risk mitigation. It's inevitable that service organizations will encounter some type of security incident. Whether it's big or small, organizations who mitigate risks that lead to business disruptions will be better prepared. For service organizations committed to delivering secure services, they'll need to demonstrate to the auditor during a SOC 2 audit that they mitigate risks that do not lead to business disruptions. For this trust service criteria to pass, a well-documented business continuity plan must be in place, along with evidence that it was tested on an annual basis, as well as the risk assessment that's being performed as discussed in trust service criteria number 3. Mitigations should also be put in place for all those risks that were identified.